Are you all familiar with think tanks? If you know what a think tank is, then raise your arm and raise it up high so that we can see it and you move a little bit. Okay, so quite a few of you know what think tanks are, but let me explain it just for everyone because it's often a somewhat specific institution. It's essentially a collection, that's where the idea of tank comes from, a collection of experts that do policy relevant research. Some people say it's a little bit like a university without students. So they're not distracted by students, by exams, by helping students develop their PhDs. And the other difference is the advice they're trying to give is typically policy relevant. So for actual issues. Some of the things we discussed right now, what you heard from Julia with regards to disinformation, think tanks work on that. What we heard from Georgi with regards to the social media platform, how to regulate those social media platforms that we are on and that this event is on, this is a question that think tanks work on and have very big influence on. Questions like the one that Julia just ended on, what goes on in Ukraine right now, what goes on in Georgia right now, is something that think tanks work on where they often have unique expertise. Diplomats rotate, as you know, think tanks stay around. So even if you don't know about think tanks, one can say that in a way think tanks know about you. They know about the kinds of things you're interested in. And this is what we worked on. This is in a way, CRC is a kind of think tank. It's a kind of fact tank, if you will. But this is an issue we worked on. And while think tanks broadly are something positive, like in so many things, they can also have a downside, or there's another angle to this. What I want to talk about specifically today is transparency, and with the argument that transparency is beautiful if you have nothing to hide. This was a kind of advertising by Heineken in a beach in Timor-Leste, where I was also working on anti-corruption issues. But making it more specific to think tanks, one of the reasons why I started thinking about it in a lot of depth was when I saw this article written by a friend and acquaintance who spent quite some time in Georgia as well, which related to banking regulation. Now, not all of you will necessarily remember because it was a long time ago, but one of the big ruptures, something that helped populists rise to power, was the 2008 financial crisis. Steve Bannon, specifically one of the advisors that helped engineer the rise of Donald Trump, keeps talking about how 2008 was a signature event. The banks and bankers made millions and billions and in the end got bailed out and average citizens paid for that. Consequently, there was an idea to regulate, to restrict what those banks could do. And some of the people that got involved in the process of regulation, as shown here in the caricature, here's a law that's trying to get implemented. Some of those that got involved in regulation were think tanks, making arguments in favor of some kind of regulation and sometimes against other kinds of regulation. But then the question is, why do they do that? And are there maybe some other interests? And you start spending time on think tank websites and trying to find out that this particular think tank makes an argument about this particular issue, but might there be a financial interest? And it turned out, by the declaration that people had to give officially, you couldn't actually figure that out. There's now a US filing of tax, the kind of tax declaration they hand in, and what you get is the kind of total amount of money that think tanks got, in this case $28 million. What you couldn't find out is who actually gives that money. And this is true across many countries in the world, that you don't actually know who supports particular policy research. And so that creates a really profound problem, arguably, because when, let's say, rich autocratic regimes want some nice write-ups, they in principle could go, and they have gone, they have done exactly that, go to a think tank and get a nice write-up about how maybe democracy is an issue, but in other ways they're really big reformers. Banking regulation I talked about, a lot of the other regulation, again, we talked about disinformation, social media platforms, so the money really, really mattered. Lots of people realized this mattered. In fact, we did early on idea of one of my colleagues who was involved in that was to do a literature review on this. And it turned out that when we looked through that, you see up there, there's a page number. These are very, very brief kind of summaries. Some of the later summaries are even shorter. There were dozens, many dozens of articles that showed lots of people were concerned about the lack of transparency of research funding, that you didn't know who was paying for the think tanks. So clearly something to think about how you can deal with that. But there hadn't been much progress. Some people thought, maybe we need new regulation, but that creates the problem if the state regulates. This often has other disadvantages. And then one thing we came up with was an idea, why not just measure it? Why not use data to measure the extent to which think tanks are transparent? And not do it as a ranking. That's really important. Rankings are toxic for many reasons. They're also meaningless. It doesn't mean very much to you what is the best hotel in the world or the best restaurant in the world if after this event here you just want to grab some dinner in Sololaki. What matters to you is perhaps what kind of restaurant you're looking at. So ratings, that's why a 5-star is tells you something meaningful about hotels. It tells you essentially if you only have a credit card and you're otherwise in your swimming trunks or bikini, you'll be all right because you can walk in, there's going to be a bathrobe, there'll be a shower, etc. And if you go to a 1-star, it means typically you bring a lot more. So it's something meaningful with a rating. We try to replicate it here, and we said 5-star means it's highly transparent. What would we want to know? That all donors are listed, the exact funding amount, and normally what precisely they ended up getting the money for. 4-star means you have them in categories so that you can distinguish whether one, say, social media platform is a huge donor or maybe just a contributor of $1,000 as part of a membership fee, because clearly there's a difference if a think tank receives $3 million for something or if they receive $3,000. And then all the way down. And the idea was this is a way that everybody understands. We could have used grades, but then some people use 1 as a top grade, in other contexts 5 is the top grade. Some people use A, B, C as grading some ways. 5 stars people can understand. This is what we decided to do. And we tried it. And then we decided we shouldn't actually do the ratings ourselves. I shouldn't do the rating myself. We should have something in order for data to be reliable. What should it be? Replicable. So with those standards, we recruited raters. One of the great pieces about this, a lot of this work was done in Georgia with Georgian raters to look at websites, 2 raters looking at each think tank website to come up with a rating. And it turned out that worked pretty well, but there's still discrepancies, sometimes because information is fragmented, so we'd had an adjudicator. So we had a clean process that was replicable and that worked and that yielded actually precise results in the sense, or true results in the sense that if information is internally consistent, that is one of the kind of tests for what truth is, and that's what we managed to do in that way. We then engaged with the think tanks in the process of doing all that and described what we were trying to do. So you see here actually not so many things to click. We need to update the website a little bit. It's a bit old right now, but not so many things to click. And then we wrote them a letter and said, I'm happy to share that with you individually in case you're curious. We said, in the process of looking at websites of more than 100 think tanks, we wrote a letter to those ranked 0 to 3, not to the ones 4 and 5 because they were doing well already. And we found that your transparency with regards to research funding is not as good as that of several other leaders in the field. If you want to change this, let us know. And in that way, engage them in an argument, often on the basis, this from one of these organizations, actually slightly different, on the basis of referring to that they themselves often make an argument that they want the government to be transparent. In a way, think tanks, or all of us, if we want to do work with data, we rely on the oxygen of getting this data but then in a way we should provide it ourselves too. And we made reference to some think tanks that were doing this well, that were listing these things in detail. And we also could highlight that this wasn't just a matter of the same old institutions in rich countries being ahead, because typically those are big institutions with a lot of money, but we could show that actually in some cases, institutions in other places were also doing the transparency already. In fact, as it turned out, when we did our first look at more than 100 institutions, it turned out that 2 institutions in Georgia, EPRC, Transparency International Georgia, were already among the most transparent of these more than 100 organizations at the time. And so in the process, just of doing the baseline, of doing the first check, you see on the right, on your left, so to speak, on your left, we have 12 institutions. This was done kind of in the January and then April. Actually, it's kind of switched here where the averages are, but you kind of see it moves across. Within that short time, we increased the transparency of the institutions we were looking at, almost doubling the amount of 5-star institutions and adding a little bit to the 4-star institutions. So actually quite a significant movement. One of the key things about that was that it allowed people to feel proud about themselves. And again, it allowed institutions, in this case, a great institution in Kenya, the Institute of Economic Affairs in Kenya, to announce that they were ranked as 5-star. And I think that's that to me was one great thing about that system that I liked about it, because it wasn't just replicating the typical hierarchies. If you live in Washington, if you're in DC, if you're maybe in some other hub of the place, you're excellent, and in other places it's very hard to do so, but rather an institution in Kenya was right up there with top institutions in the world, with other very transparent institutions in the world, and they could make the argument down there. You see from Kwame Ovino making the argument, if we fail to aim for high transparency, then we reduce our ability to demand budget transparency in Kenya. Or turn it the other way around, we're transparent as an institution, therefore you could be as well as a government. These were the imprints after a few 2 or 3 months on our website. So you saw that except for a handful of states in sub-Saharan Africa, essentially people from all across the world within 2 or 3 months of us launching the website had actually looked at it. In some cases just 2 or 3 clicks. So it's not, and of course the biggest interest in the United States, because the United States, the top 20 think tanks themselves have an annual budget taken together of more than $1 billion. So obviously there's a lot of people in there. But you could see that this was an issue that was not just limited to one location or one particular context, but really of much, much broader interest. How did it develop over time? Well, I showed you kind of 5 and 4-star. And then you can kind of see the progression over time. So we started with 12 think tanks that were 5-star in 2013, and the last time we did it, we were planning to do it last year, but in the pandemic, there are a few other things that people need to worry about. In think tanks, we had more than tripled, quadrupled the number. So in that way, one of the key things we wanted to establish was that this kind of 5-star transparency, where every citizen can immediately find the information of how policy research is funded, that becomes a standard and the norm. And as you see here, this is arguably one of the best, one of the think tanks with the biggest impact on global development policy, on working on a lot of issues across health. They actually used our little label there, the 5 stars that we kind of did ourselves somewhere in a kind of free version of some software. So again, helping to establish the overall standard. There still is quite a lot to do though. And we're not there yet, arguably, in this. one of the things that journalists should do as a matter of just routine is that they ask if policy research gets done. They should ask, how is it funded? We recently had a scholar associated with an American university writing about the context here without disclosing his particular kind of funding. And this needs to stop, because it undercuts the credibility in research, or let me put it the positive way. Transparency communicates that you have confidence in the integrity of your research. You can stand somewhere and say, yes, I've been funded by X, Y, Z, but I stand here because the data is solid enough so that I can defend it. Another key thing that needs to happen is that donors need to change. If donors demand as a matter of routine that their grantees disclose, it would be much, much easier to change things. We understand that there's some contexts where this is not going to be possible. Some organizations live in contexts where they're being targeted. There are sometimes kind of very complicated setups, but the question is not what the exceptions are. The question should be, what is the standard? And right now, the standard remains that in too many cases, institutions are opaque about who funds them. So what did we want to do? We wanted to change a little bit the conversation about thinking about excellence so that we get away from rankings to the idea of ratings, and reinforce the notion that wherever you are, if you do the right thing, if you're committed to quality, you can run an excellent institution, and you don't need to rely on any international ranking, whether it be for universities or think tanks or anything else. It was important that we have some standards to kind of help to establish a standard, also standard that is doable, yeah, that doesn't impose some kind of crazy levels of disclosure, because not everyone is comfortable with disclosing, let's say, salaries at all levels. And there are reasons sometimes against that too. And we wanted better practice. Now, I wanted to show you one other way that potentially one could apply something like this. And I know it's a little bit out there, and I know it's a kind of a bit of a hypothetical idea, but this is just something we worked with. How many here in the room believe that there is something like a conspiracy that can take on average 3 years of the lives of people in most industrialized countries? How many people in this room believe this? There's a conspiracy essentially to shorten your lives. I believe it. Let me demonstrate to you why with data. I know I'm exaggerating a bit, but so just follow me in this thought experiment. This is what it is, of how you could use some of this. When we look at the United States, life expectancy is going down. Now we know a lot of that's due to the opioid crisis, to the deaths of despair, but generally still look at the data. This is a kind of reputable source, yeah. We have a country that has huge amounts of healthcare expenditure, as you see here, but still much lower life expectancy, and arguably more than 3 years than a lot of other countries. And yes, the deaths of despair, the opioid crisis are one explanation, but there's also another explanation. And it's often the abbreviation that people use is SAD, the Standard American Diet, SAD. This is where most people get their food nowadays in industrialized contexts. Not necessarily in kind of a rural context, but in industrialized context, this is where they get their food. And some of this, oh, the one on the right doesn't render. Some of this here, you see a little bit of fruit that was somehow cut off here in the presentation, but this is how a lot of those shelves look. And yes, that's one of the reasons why lives are shorter. We know that the Mediterranean diet, there's absolutely no doubt, I think at this point, that the Mediterranean diet is a lot better than the SAD diet, yeah, the standard American diet, but this is what you see in supermarkets. And this is the reality that you're surrounded with. If you go after this, you go to a supermarket, these are the things you're going to face. So in some ways, you could use a 5-star ranking for this as well and say, how much of the shelf space is taken up by what kind of products? And how healthy are they? We kind of know this. Yeah, we know that things that are made kind of frozen pizza is really terrible for you. That's not a contested thing. And we know that some of the things on top, fruits and vegetables, are really good for you. And think of shelf space as really very communicative. It's a way of saying that's very, very scarce space. So it's not just your convenience, it's taking incredibly scarce space in centrally accessible locations and pushing these things in your face when you walk into those supermarkets. So you could actually use this kind of approach and walk through a supermarket and identify that in particular supermarkets, the meters of shelf space that are filled with positive things are a lot smaller than, kind of in this one's actually still okay, but is actually the minority overall. And here I've just done, this is just again a thought experiment, but with real data. And remember where I started saying, can data actually change things? This is from supermarkets in a German trial run. And where I say, you compare broadly positive to broadly negative. And if you want to put it there, you can kind of call it killer index, because those places are really going to harm you. They're going to harm you personally. And so you arrive at the result that indeed these organic supermarkets on the left, they are more expensive, but they might actually be a lot better for you. And changing the default environment, thinking about the default environment, thinking how we measure things so that in the end we can change our own behavior, not necessarily impose anything on these institutions, but changing where do we go to as a default because those places are safer for us. That's just one of the ways you can look at the world as well. Try to remember the last time you went in a supermarket, other than when you were in an incredible hurry, and where you came out in your shopping basket with exactly the things you were planning to buy when you went in. I would suggest that that's the minority of the cases. In most cases, you walk in and you have a lot more things in your basket when you walk out. And why is that the case? Because certain things are in your face. So again, this is just one thought experiment that we spent a few hours on. The larger thing that I really wanted to leave you with is the key point that if you make intransparency transparent, if you use data, and if you use it well in communicating with institutions, also really important, allowing institutions to win. We weren't just out to kind of highlight those that weren't doing well, but we created in a way institutions that could demonstrate that they were committed to excellence and transparency. You can actually make a difference. There were some limitations for that I think are also important to share. It wasn't easy to get donors interested in what we were doing. We got some funding from OSI, which was fantastic. And then subsequently, we ended up funding most of the things ourselves. That has a great advantage because it means you're indestructible. When you decide to actually allocate time to it, you can make a difference. But of course, it has the disadvantage that you kind of trade things off against everything else that you're doing. It does have one other consideration that I think is really important, and that made me feel not ambivalent. I still think this is entirely the right thing, but there's transparency. If you want real transparency, you also, in the end, have to advocate for a degree of tolerance. There was the example of a founder of a guy that briefly was CEO of Mozilla Firefox, who had given a donation against marriage equality. He was a convinced Catholic. And at a time when Barack Obama was against marriage equality, he had also given money to that cause. That's not my personal point of view, but it was his point of view. And years later, more than 5 or 6 years later, this donation many years ago ended up costing him his job. And that, in my mind, doesn't really work. We can either have the argument of transparency, but that means transparency for people that think differently from the way that we think, really profoundly differently. Or we say we will actually use Twitter and other social media to go after people that think differently, but then the argument is going to be, actually, we need to keep this information private because donor privacy ultimately is a protection of their own lives. On my side, my preference is for a really deep view of diversity, which includes people that I fundamentally object to, should also be in this particular context, should also be part of the debate. But we should be honest where we're coming from so that we understand our differences, and in that way maybe can also identify where in the end